thank you for coming out to our tech talk on new approaches to diversity and inclusion, building the tech sector we want. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Tarsha McCormick, and I am the head of diversity and inclusion for Thoughtworks North America. And I am joined on the panel today with Melinda Epler, who is the co-founder and CEO of Change Catalyst, and Kyla Williams, the president and CEO of Henry Williams Love Foundation. So, ladies, why don't you start by just telling us a little about yourself and how you ended up in tech?
I'm up first. Hi. How I ended up in tech. So I had a very, very special father who understood the landscape of the job prospects in the world. So he said to me at 4 years old, when I was eating some Fruit Loops sitting on the front stoop as he read the paper, that technology is a thing, and it's going to be a big thing. And I'm going to go out and buy you one of these computer things. And my expectation is that you learn everything about technology, because if you do, according to the job prospects, you'll always have one, which means you'll not have to ask me for money, and you'll live a good life. And certainly that introduction, albeit a little bit brass, certainly set the tone for me to be able to move into the technology field. I actually have a STEM background. I was sharing earlier. I went to medical school. I actually graduated with a degree in biological sciences, cellular physiology. I was going to be a physician, and then got to my rotations and realized that I did not like blood. And so it's kind of necessary if you're going to be a doctor to kind of be okay with blood. So I left that educational opportunity, fell in love with human services, and then kind of have become this technology champion for those who require a little bit of support, giving some voice for those who need it.
Awesome. I started in my role in life has always been social impact. Can you hear me in the back? Okay, yeah. So I started in cultural anthropology, really looking at how change happens in societies, how individuals are part of that change and champion change, and ended up going to art school, learning, kind of started in tech in art school, learning Photoshop and design and then video art, and ended up in film school at USC and became a documentary filmmaker, which is a tech job, actually, very much so. I was an editor and also director, worked on a lot of social impact focused films, and then found myself wanting to really change the way business was done. And so worked with mission-driven brands around storytelling, strategy, branding strategy, marketing strategy to really change the world through business. That took me to San Francisco. One of my clients made me a job offer that I couldn't refuse, so I was an executive at an engineering firm, and it was one of the worst experiences of my professional life, where I was the only woman in a leadership team of 19, and it just was not set up for me. It was little microaggressions, much bigger macroaggressions, all kind of left me feeling like I couldn't be there, I couldn't do this. And my bigger thought was, if I can't, if this is not working for me, it's not working for a lot of other people too, and that's a really big problem when we're talking about changing the world and changing the way we do things. And we really need diverse leaders to be leading our companies, to be leading our countries, to be leading the world. And so I left my job as an executive and took on the tech industry, really founded Change Catalyst to create change in the tech industry around diversity and inclusion. So I did that. I left in 2014, and I've been working on that ever since.
Great. And for me, I'd like to say it was an accident that I ended up in tech. But I heard someone say a couple of weeks ago that just because it isn't your plan doesn't mean it's not your destiny. And so I've always had a passion for human services and helping people and law and education. And out of undergrad, I ended up working in social services for 4 years, helping families who had an open case with the Department of Children and Family Services, and helping them to get resources. Lot of issues with that system. I felt like I was really band-aiding a problem. There was a lot of red tape. And so I ended up going to work for a large consulting company, helping one of their clients administer benefits. And a year and a half into that, I got a call from a friend from undergrad who worked for Thoughtworks. She happens to be here today. I won't name any names, Tracy Dantley. And she said, hey, I work for this amazing company, and we are looking for some help in our recruiting department. Would you be interested? And said, absolutely. And so once I got here, I started to really understand the importance of tech and the importance of people from underrepresented communities having a voice and a say in tech. And so my passion came from, one, being an underrepresented minority, really getting out and trying to help people understand the importance of tech. And so I'm a champion of it. And again, I believe that this was really my destiny. So I want to lay the foundation a little bit about why this conversation is important. So several years ago, a lot of the big tech companies came under scrutiny to release their diversity numbers. And the numbers revealed something that we've all known, that the tech industry continues to be primarily dominated by white men, right? There's a huge gender disparity, but there's an even bigger disparity when it comes to people of color, specifically African American women and Latinx women. But the good thing that came from them releasing those numbers is that there was a lot of media attention about the lack of diversity in tech. And so as a result, a lot of companies really started to give more thought to diversity and inclusion. And over the last several years, we've seen a lot of changes, but guess what? We still have a long way to go. And so we really need to think about what are some solutions and how do we build that tech industry that we want to see. And so Melinda, I want to ask you the first question. So your organization, Change Catalyst, helps organizations create inclusive tech ecosystems. So what recommendations or best practices would you suggest for an organization that is just starting to think about diversity and inclusion? Like, where should they start?
Yeah, I start with knowing where you are. So start by measuring the data, measuring diversity and measuring inclusion. There's some great inclusion surveys out there that you can take. Oh, sorry. I have asthma, so and actually the chair doesn't help.
Feel free to stand. And again, there's some seats in the front row.
Yeah. So start by measuring where you are in terms of diversity and in terms of inclusion. The data is important, and also the human communications are important, and listening is important. So you also have to have some one-on-one conversations to really understand where people are at an emotional level, where people are, like, you can only tell so much in a survey, and people are only going to tell you so much in a survey. You really also have to have those one-on-one conversations with people to really see what's going on. And it might be that you have that with an independent third-party consultancy that really can come in and be that that independent ear that can give you the results, but also allows people to be more open in those conversations. So start with measuring, and then I would say there's a huge trend in the industry right now to start with unconscious bias training. Don't do that. It doesn't work. It only works in certain cases, and it only works with a strategy behind it and with a culture that is already ready and primed for unconscious bias training. So if you look at kind of where people are along an allyship spectrum, there are people that are actively opposed to diversity and inclusion. There are people that are just kind of starting to think about it. There are people that are thinking about it and ready to kind of step in, make little baby steps. There are people that like take a jump in and are ready to learn, make mistakes, and so on. And then there are people that are working on it every day of their life. They're more advocates. If you start with unconscious bias training over here, it's going to push people further that direction. And that's where you see like the James Damores, the kind of the people that are actively pushing against diversity and inclusion across the board. That's over here. And if you do that, if you do unconscious bias training too early, you're going to push more people over in that direction. You need to do some other things before you get a good culture here, at least. And then hopefully everybody becomes an advocate.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I would also add, you have to be committed to focusing on diversity and inclusion, being it for the long haul. Like, you aren't going to see the changes that you want to see within 3 months or 6 months. It is a journey, and you have to be committed to staying on that journey. Another thing I would add is really understand why diversity and inclusion is important to your organization. Because once you understand that, you can better align your initiatives with the goals of the organization.
I would add that before we do the research and before we plot out our plan, you need to turn inward and check yourself and determine if you are a steward of diversity and inclusion, not just in technology, but in your whole entire life. Ask yourself the questions: what have you done to help further the journey for those of us who have had a more sorted pathway to get where we're trying to go? I think often we jump right into, these are the statistics and this is the plan, without doing that internal assessment to talk about thoughts and feelings and your own value system around other people. And because technology is a competitive field, where is your value system rooted in sharing versus competing and oftentimes boxing out? So I think that we have to do a lot of work internally to determine how we feel about diversity and inclusion first, before organizationally we can move any of those bullet points forward. And when we see a lot of companies that do, the one and done, we're going to, it's February, Black History Month.
We're going to check a box.
We're going to check a box. We're going to bring a black girl in, maybe this one, and she's going to say a couple of things for 20 minutes over lunch and learn, and we are now diverse, which is not at all the case.
And I think one thing that's even worse is you don't do anything in Black History Month, and you do something in Women's History Month, right? Where you're not, and it's all white women, or yeah.
I'm going to see if the mics are working.
I don't know if we're saving questions for the last.
We are. So what we're going to do is let there be audio. Okay. So yes, we're going to reserve the last 15 minutes for Q&A from the audience. So now that organizations have started to give thought to diversity and inclusion, what do you think makes for a good tech inclusive ecosystem?
Can I add one to the last question first?
Absolutely.
All right.
The other part of that is making sure that you have buy-in from the top of the organization, because what we've seen time and time again is that it's a grassroots effort, which is great, but it can only go so far. You have to have leadership really understand it, wrap their brain around it, get it, become advocates and allies themselves, and hold people accountable.
That is definitely spot on. I was chatting with a former thought worker a couple of weeks ago, chatting about diversity and inclusion, and him wanting to bring me in to really speak to their organization. And he reached out and he said, you know what, Tarsha, I don't think this is the right time to engage you. There is a lot of interest from our employees, but I don't think our CEO is there yet. So we were having a leadership team meeting, and the one Black woman on the leadership team was sharing her experience of often being pulled over by police as she was leaving as she was leaving work, and said it was a powerful, conversation, and she's being very open, and she's being vulnerable, and she's sharing. And afterwards, the CEO pulled me aside and said, I think she has a chip on her shoulder. I'm like, that's what he took from that conversation. And so I said, definitely, now is not the time to engage me, because your leadership team, your leader is not ready for that conversation yet. Because if you don't have the support of the leadership, then any effort that you try to roll out isn't going to be successful.
To your point in reference to leadership planning around bringing an organization into a more inclusive culture, oftentimes when there are decision making, they're not including all the people that should be sitting at the table. So they're already starting with exclusionary practices because they feel they've made a value judgment about the worthiness, the opinions, the thoughts, the feelings of people who are outside of the circle of importance. So when we're talking about like technology, you don't have to be in the technology department of your company to be sitting at the table to offer an opinion about how to be more diverse in this Chicagoland area or beyond. Oftentimes, the very people that are the recipients of the exclusionary practice are sitting in other positions. And so now you're further excluding them, and they don't have the opportunity to speak up for themselves. So I think how we do thought leadership around strategic planning for a inclusion plan needs to change. And I think our leaders, unfortunately, have been empowered to believe that this is a choice and not what should be just the right thing to do. And they get bonuses, and that helps them to believe that. I'm just saying.
So bringing it back to your question around ecosystem is, and this is following on your point, is that when we develop in our companies, there's an ecosystem, and diversity and inclusion strategies need to work at each of those elements of the ecosystem. So not just on recruiting, but also culture, on and HR, of course, and product is often left out. Crucial. If you're not building products by and for a diverse population, you're not really building for the world, right? You need to be building with an innovative, diverse team that's really going to get you to the next stage. Product, the engineering team, of course, and so all of those leaders need to be at the table. All of those, the strategy needs to focus in all of those departments as well. When you're looking at, so we work on inclusive tech ecosystems, inclusive startup ecosystems around the world. We're looking at the industry ecosystem. And so on that level, that starts in education. It starts before education, but let's say it starts at kindergarten and goes all the way through 12, through higher ed coding schools and boot camps now as well. So the education side, the entrepreneurship, so building an inclusive entrepreneurship ecosystem means actually investing in underrepresented entrepreneurs as well. So Digital Undivided just came out with a new study looking at investment in, they have been looking at investment in Black women. They just looked at Latinas as well. I believe that since the 90s, just 0.04% of all venture capital has gone to Latinas. 0.04%. 0.2% for African American women. So it's something that drastically needs to change. If we're talking about, building inclusive companies, we need to be talking about that from the ground up and really creating change in the venture capital space. Also, policy has a huge impact on the tech ecosystem overall. The EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, once there is a policy in place, the EEOC and the Department of Labor can then sue the companies and make them adhere to the law. So policymakers have a huge role in this, as well as media. Media definitely has a role to play. And when media and the press are really pushing the industry forward and telling the stories of diverse people in tech, then suddenly you can see it. If you can see it, you can be it. And so the stories that we tell also make a huge difference.
And hashtag representation matters. So Melinda, you talked a little about a mistake that companies often make when they start to think about diversity and inclusion, which is not laying the foundation and then starting with the unconscious bias awareness. Are there any other mistakes that you see that organizations often make, or lessons learned that you've seen in the D&I space?
Yeah, the big one is starting and ending with recruiting. Is when you focus only on recruiting and you're not focusing on retention, it's just this revolving door. You bring people in, you lose people. You bring people in, you lose people, and you don't just lose people in the company. We're losing people in the industry as a result of that. So it's a real dangerous thing.
Yeah, I would agree, and I think sometimes organizations tend to be one-dimensional with their approach to diversity. So it's always just about gender. At some point you have to expand that footprint, and you have to look at the entire umbrella of diversity. I think it's also about not connecting with their employees, not understanding what their concerns are. We can create a plan, but if it is not aligned with what the employees believe is important, then it's never going to work. You're not going to see the success. Also, shying away from tough conversations, right? We have to be able to have the conversations that matter and that impact people. So whether it's racism or sexism or police brutality, everything that's going on in the world right now, our employees don't unpack that and leave it at the door when they walk into the office. It has an impact on them. And so we have to figure out how to create those spaces to support people, but also make people feel comfortable having those conversations at work.
Absolutely. I remember after the presidential election, there were several of my colleagues at the Chicago Community Trust that had feelings. And
that's a great way of saying that.
And we gathered in a conference room to kind of, decompress about our feelings. But I just thought about all of the other things that I have feelings about, and how there was never a need for comfort around those feelings. Trayvon Martin, Laquan McDonald, those are things that impact me and impact our communities, and oftentimes the communities that we're providing services to or partnering with, but we never talk about that. And that's traumatic. I've been pulled over by the police and had my vehicle searched, and I got a PhD. I am a tax-abiding, law-abiding citizen, howsoever. I was pulled over, and it's terrifying to be in a space having all of that trauma also sitting on your shoulders. But and so one may argue that the workplace is not the place for those types of conversations. But we spend most of our time at work. We do all types of things at work. Some appropriate, some not so much. But why can't we have that type of conversation? Why can't there be a comforting and an understanding of other pains, societal pains that may hurt the people who are employed by that company?
So that is a great segue into my next question about intersectionality. Is everyone familiar with what intersectionality is? Okay. I see a lot of yeses, but I think I heard a no somewhere. So intersectionality really is the overlapping of several social identities that you have. So whether that's gender, race, sexual orientation, ability, socioeconomic status, and how those intersections can often create privilege or disadvantages for people. And so I want to talk a little bit about why intersectionality is important.
Well, I mean, we're not all one thing. And I think that taking that into consideration, especially as it pertains to retention, is important. You have to kind of understand the pathway and how we all got to be, where we are and the specific journeys. And that's not excluding anyone else's journey. That's not to say that because someone's path was a little more rocky or there were some systemic issues that prevented them to, get where they needed to go quicker, that we don't, discredit that. But I think that we tend to not look at people. We tend to look at output, and output can be faceless. It's easy to not identify with output and make that your expectation. But, we're real people with real feelings. And just as we have policy in our HR manuals that give us bereavement, we should also have some type of policy that indicates that if you're having some type of, intersectional issue, that there should be a little bit of grace. Like my grandmother talks about grace all the time. I kind of tapped on her grace nerve, let me just say. But I think that we need a bit of grace in employment. And I think that if we had some of that in the intersectionality of us all, that we would be much more productive, actually, because I think that there would be greater understanding.
Yeah, it shows up in a lot of different ways in the workplace too. It shows up in the data that we collect.
Mm-hmm.
It happens a lot where, you can either pick African American or Latinx, right? Well, what about people who are both, right? Or Asian and Latinx, so it happens there. It happens in a big way in our ERGs internally when we're looking at employee resource groups or affinity groups, because if you're a African American, Latina, lesbian with a disability, you have 4 different possible ERGs to go to, but you only have one identity that you can talk about at each one, unless those are built in an inclusive way. It's a real problematic thing that we don't talk enough about, and we're not acknowledging enough in our workplaces. It happens in a number of different ways. There's and we're often leaving out when we talk about women. We leave out women of color. When we're talking about women of color, we're leaving out women of color with disabilities or women of color who are LGBTQ as well. And so we need to be looking at the whole person and all of those identities that you come to work with.
Yeah, and without sort of looking at things in the workplace, well, in society in general, without having that intersectional lens, we can run the risk of creating some inequities for one group while we're trying to solve it for another group. And so I think the last statistics that I saw about women in tech, I believe it was around 24%. But of those 24%, only 3% identify as African American and 2% identify as Latino. So if our focus is purely on gender, essentially what we're doing is we're focusing on white women. And so we really have to start to give some thought to intersectionality and how we support people in multiple identities.
Yeah, one thing that's been a big aha moment for me over the last few years, I've learned a ton about different identities, different groups that are marginalized. And one of my big aha moments was I identify as a woman first. There are a lot of Black women that identify as Black first, right? That is a huge difference and an important distinction that we need to think about when we're building programs for women. That needs to be a core part of that thought.
And I think a lot of times we identify that way because society has identified us as such. You know, I'm Black before I come through the door. If my name is ethnic, I'm Black before you offer me an interview. And there are folks who probably didn't even want to come to this talk because there were two Black women sitting on the panel and they're tired of this equity discussion. So, and we'll get into allyship a bit later in the conversation. Black people who are, if we're the inevitable party, it's hard for us to move the needle to equity if we don't have allies who are showing up for us and seeing the intersectionality that I am a Black woman who works in tech and who does many other different things and who is many different things.
So we've talked a lot of, I'm sorry, were you going to add something, Melinda?
I don't remember that.
I'm sorry. So we've talked a lot about the workplace and some challenges, but there are a lot of challenges that women of color face before they even get to the workplace. And if we don't understand those challenges, we really can't start to think about solutioning. And Kyla, I know you've done a lot of work with girls of color through the Henry Williams Love Foundation and the Shuri Project. And I'd like you to share a little bit about the Shuri Project. But what are some challenges that you're seeing in this community, and what can we do individually as well as organizations to help?
So how many people saw the movie Black Panther? Okay, pretty good. Depends on the crowd. Sometimes there's lots of hands, sometimes not. But very good movie. As a woman in tech, seeing that movie and the character Shuri, who, you know, designed and ran the tech lab in Wakanda, and truly, if she didn't help the brother out, he wasn't gonna make it to the end of the movie. So having that as a strong character on the screen really inspired me to figure out how I could bring that pride that I felt sitting in that theater into our communities. Because one of the things that I know working in our lower socioeconomic communities, especially here on the south and west sides of the city, is that our young Black girls have very low self-esteem. And they have very low self-worth. They have very low exposure to career opportunities. Black women are one of the highly tracked classifications of people into a career track. You know, instead of saying you can be an entrepreneur, they'll say you can do hair. Instead of saying you can be a RN, they'll say you can be a CNA. You can be that. And now in tech, instead of saying, you know, you can be a data researcher, they say you can be a coder. So trying to identify an opportunity to raise self-esteem, to help with their communication skills because they're very poor. They don't know how to express themselves appropriately. They don't have good interpersonal skills. They're bright, but they're a little rough around the edges. And I wanted to design a program that kind of spoke to those areas of improvement while dropping some technology knowledge on them through the continuum. So not just you can code, but all of the thousands and thousands of different job types along the technology continuum that they could actually occupy. So we did a pilot of that this past summer. We had 15 girls in the program. It's a 6-week program. During the summer, it runs every day. We feed them breakfast, we feed them lunch, and then they have a earning incentive where if they finish all of their learning objectives, they get to keep the laptop that they learned how to build their websites on and how they did their electronic vision boards and all the other technology-related learning activities that we did. And just today, so today I was not feeling well, and I think I have a cold or something, but I got an email from one of the participants who emailed me, and she didn't even know how to email before she got into the Shuri project. But she emailed me to tell me that she missed me, first of all, and that she used the skills that she learned in the Shuri project to do really well on one of her written papers. Part of our outcomes for Shuri is not only increasing their digital literacy, but increasing their general literacy, because as we talk about retention in an employment situation, like you gotta write stuff down, you gotta send written correspondence. And so the Shuri Project is just one of many solutions that are offered here in the city that really tries to address some of those areas of improvement for young Black girls in communities that lack that exposure, lack those mentors and models to let them know that a technology career is possible.
That's awesome. I think that's worth applause.
I appreciate it.
Great, great. So I attended the Tech Inclusion Conference with several other thought workers a couple of weeks ago, and Melinda and her team at Change Catalyst is responsible for the Tech Inclusion Conferences. And so while there, I learned that less than 10% of all venture capital deals go to women, people of color, and LGBT founders. And so Melinda is doing some work with Backstage Capital. And I'd like for you to talk a little bit about what is the work, but also what is the importance of incubators and accelerators in helping to create equity in tech.
Yeah. So Backstage Capital was founded by Arlen Hamilton. Okay, this is my second week at Backstage Capital. So I believe it was started about 5 or 6 years ago by Arlen Hamilton, and she's an African American lesbian woman who she has this amazing energy and ability to just go past all the adversity and raise several big funds for people of color, women, and LGBTQ founders. And then she just launched in the last few months, and it's About Damn Time Fund, which is specifically for Black women founders, and $1 million per founder, which is huge. There are very few African American women that have received $1 million in funding, so that she alone is giving Black women $1 million for their startups is amazing, and much needed. That said, yeah, the statistics I know is less than 5% go to women, people of color, and LGBTQ founders combined. And so it's pretty dismal, and things need to change. So with those funds growing strong, there's still a need for more access to mentors, to curriculum, to the tools needed to really scale and grow your startups. There's a real access problem and an access to opportunity problem because of the huge biases in the accelerator programs that are thriving right now. And so Wayne and I, my co-founder and I at Change Catalyst, have joined Backstage Capital to help them develop accelerators in 4 different cities across the world. Those are Philadelphia, Detroit, London, and LA. And we picked cities that were a little bit outside of San Francisco and New York because there's less access, again, as you go into other cities that are not those 2 main cities. We are building them from the ground up, really focused on underrepresented entrepreneurs. There are a few other accelerators out there that have done this, and we're building on the foundations that they have championed and able to really build things in a unique way, a way that works specifically for people that have been marginalized for so long and have specific needs. And a lot of founders are working through imposter syndrome as well as some other just trauma that you go through after hearing no so many times. And so we're really building a curriculum that works specifically for the rest of us.
Okay. So we have time for one additional question before we go to Q&A from the audience. But Melinda recently did a tech talk on 3 ways to be a better ally. And she just hit over 1 million views. Yay, congratulations. And so I want to talk about the importance of allyship in creating the tech culture that we want to see and creating the tech ecosystem we want to see.
Yeah, I believe that we all need to be allies for each other, no matter who we are. And we often talk about male allyship or white male allyship, but really it's all of us working together as allies. We all do that for each other more than we are now. And there's proven results. I don't know how many of you all know what happened at Nike a few months ago. Okay, very few. Okay, so this is just an example of how women can be allies for each other. Is at Nike there was a culture of harassment, sexual harassment, and the women at Nike basically banded together and started documenting what had happened with different people, and they passed it on and they kept doing it. Not every woman, lots of women that had been through harassment with different people documented it to the point where it became public and ousted a lot of the leaders that were behind it. That's the power of allyship, is really being there for each other, telling the stories, stepping in, and together we can make a bigger difference. That's what I believe is and really allyship is about being a good human, right? Is knowing when you see something is not quite right, is saying something, is doing something, and often that means, we have to learn what's right and what's wrong. We have to learn what is a microaggression and what other people are feeling, and learn the language, learn pronouns, learn how do I describe my identity. It's a constant learning process. I'm constantly learning about how to be a better ally, and we all need to. But I think that once we do become better allies for each other, we will fundamentally transform companies.
Kyla, any final thoughts before we go to Q&A?
I definitely agree with that. I talk often about the apathetic middle. The folks that it says it doesn't affect me, so I don't have to get involved and I don't have to say anything about it. But the apathetic middle weighs heavily on, inequity. When you don't say anything, then you're giving power to the other side. It's always amazing to me that you can see something going wrong, and there are very few people, especially when it comes to race and gender, that will say, that's not so right. Like, that's not appropriate. And I think that we need to all be empowered to feel like we can speak out around injustice, regardless of whoever is on the other end of that. And that will be helpful to making things a little bit more equitable in the workplace and beyond.
Great, thank you. So we have time for a couple of questions from the audience, if there are any. Don't be shy. Okay.
No one else asked, but I'm gonna ask a bunch. This is for Melinda. So you mentioned that companies shouldn't do unconscious bias training if they don't have the ecosystem in place. I think my company does have the ecosystem in place. I am in charge of rolling out the unconscious bias training, so I'm curious what tips do you have for unconscious bias trainings that you've seen actually be successful? What it
for a company that is ready for unconscious bias training, what are some of the ways that it can be that I've seen that it's been successful? What are some of the tactics? I have seen very little unconscious bias training be effective. And I would reframe it as allyship training, honestly. Retrain it as more of, instead of telling people what they're doing wrong, giving them the tools and the language and the skills to step in for each other and to be better humans, better allies. Because that's where the resentment comes in, is when you start to tell people that they're thinking wrong, they're doing wrong, like, instead of really focusing on the solutions. What are the solutions that they can be doing right?
I wasn't sure. So doing my current work in diversity inclusion and also being part of a group of diversity, equity, inclusion professionals in Chicago, a lot of people struggle with getting, like Melinda, you said, getting all of you senior leaders to buy into this, especially because a lot of us diversity and inclusion advocates and professionals either do this in addendum to our full-time role, it's something that's just getting spearheaded off the ground, or you have one person doing it and you can't rely on one person to make miracles happen overnight. What do you recommend to people who are trying to get senior leadership, or even like local leadership, like even just management of certain departments, to really buy into that this is important, this is just not a hobby? In my own experience, I've had my own manager tell me that my diversity inclusion role in addendum to my full-time role is a hobby. And I gracefully replied that my gender, race, and ethnicity and opinions are not a hobby. But then I was looked at as angry woman of color. So what do you recommend? We've definitely touched on allyship, but especially people who are trying to get those allies, trying to get people just to believe and give it a chance. I don't believe in, navigating by fear. A lot of people say, put the numbers in front of them right now. But what do you recommend besides that?
So I'll jump in. So I was lucky to work for Thoughtworks, where I didn't have to create that business case, because it's always sort of been in the fiber of who we were as an organization. I get asked this question often, and I don't think there's one particular approach that's going to work for every organization. I do think it's important to give them the numbers, because for some leaders, it's about that business case. It's about the bottom line for them. But also it's talking about what's happening in society. This isn't going away, right? Other organizations are really starting to focus on diversity and inclusion. So why wouldn't your organization start to think about it as well? Starting to make the connection between what is happening in society, really what your employees want. If your employees believe that it is important and it's something that is impacting them, then you should give some real thought to paying attention to what your employees want, because ultimately you're going to have a retention problem if you don't. Literature helps as well. Maybe it's about just keeping an open mind. Make some small suggestions on some things that you can do to pilot some programs, put in some measures of success, get some feedback, and then start to build from there. But each leader is going to be different in what connects with them and how you bring them along in the journey. See, lots of hands. I think you were next.
Okay, hi, thank you all, by the way, sharing your opinions and putting this together. My question is related to sort of about that. Let's say that leaders are on board, there are HR policies to help promote diversity, inclusion, but there's still that like mind shift that needs to occur sometimes to bring people who don't identify themselves as a person of color or LGBTQIA or a woman. How do we get them to see diversity and inclusion as important? And would you recommend like maybe 3 actionable steps that we might suggest to someone who's like just clueless?
What I've seen work is conversations really do help. So like the lunch and learn, I made the joke about it earlier, but in a very strategic way, those lunch and learn conversations with diversity, inclusion kind of topics will help to identify what areas your company may be having some issues with. Getting people to talk and asking questions, probing questions. How do you feel about this? Do we value this? It's an interesting opportunity over a tuna sandwich for someone to say, you know, I never grew up around any Black people, so you're the first Black person that I've ever like talked to, and you're pretty cool. And I'm like, it's 2018. It's a start. But it's a thing, you know. Conversation is less institutional and doesn't feel so like you have to be diverse versus like, okay, I'm in a safe space now, and I can maybe share with you that I don't really know what to do, and maybe what I thought I was doing to be helpful may not be the best thing. So conversations are helpful. The Chicago Community Trust has all these on the table conversations, and one of the large themes that happened on the table day was around like, how do you broach conversations around diversity and inclusion with people that you normally don't have such serious conversations with.
I just want to interject. My current company is great. It's just somewhere I came from, where I found it to be a real issue. Management was on board, but there was just a cultural disconnect. Anyways, sorry.
Yeah, I think you shouldn't spend a lot of time trying to convince people that diversity and inclusion is important, because you can end up just running into a wall over and over again. If somebody doesn't believe it, they don't believe it. So figure out another way to get at the core solution, get at the core problem and find a solution to it. So whether that's redesigning a process, whether that's, so I'll give you an example. At the executive, when I was an executive at the engineering firm, one of my, the CFO said, you got to stop talking about this woman thing. And so I learned pretty quickly that was not going to be a topic of conversation. So how can I go about creating change when people won't talk about it? Okay, so we ended up creating a wellness program, and the wellness program had multiple parts. It had a physical wellness program, so like we did gym memberships, we did fitness trackers and things like that, and it actually did an amazing thing. It gave women in particular at the company the chance to meet outside of work, to collaborate, to have conversations outside of work and feel more valued at work. It was kind of incredible. We also did a few other things. We did emotional intelligence training with leadership team, because if you understand yourself, as you're talking about, if you understand yourself, you start to understand how you're relating to other people. And a shift happened at the leadership level there. We also did mindfulness training, which does also some of that too. It helps people understand themselves better so that they show up in a more mindful way. Not that they're thinking about diversity and inclusion, that we took that out of the conversation. It's way over here, but we're still changing the culture, still changing the way people are doing things. I also would say you can change a lot with thinking through how to shift processes, how to shift systems that are biased in themselves. Like, you don't necessarily have to change the people first, you can change the processes first.
So we are at time, but we'll take one final question from the gentleman in the back.
Hey, this was really great. I kind of have like a statement and no question. I think the problem with tech diversity in Chicago comes down to the fact that 500,000 people come into the city every day on the metro. And then, because you only have 8 hours of work, 8 hours of sleep, 8 hours of play, then people have to listen to these kind of conversations. And something I was going to wonder was, how many people here actually live in Chicago versus in the suburbs? Is this because it's in the afternoon? Because my guess is probably by 3:30, 4:30 at most of your companies, they're running to get to Ogilvy Station and running to get to the North or the South Rail to get out. So maybe we have to work with the city to really make downtown more beautiful for people that live in the city, not for people that travel into the city for a few hours, and then use the amenities while others on the southwest and some on the north side don't have access. But my question is, do you think that it's a possibility that things are going to change, knowing that the two leading venture capitalists in the whole state, our current governor and future governor, probably, have not made this to be an issue? And do you think that there's a way we can get corporations, the 136 publicly held corporations, to tell them that this is an issue, because they've led private equity and they've led venture capital, and those numbers have not changed?
Well, there are many ways to change venture capital. Definitely advocating for change with the people that are currently allocating that capital is a part of it. But we also have to change. There's a lot of wealth out there from underrepresented communities. We also have to change that and really give more access to understanding about venture capital, and so education around venture capital, so that more people of color, more LGBTQ, more women, more people with disabilities who have wealth are investing in the rest of us. I think that's a huge and untapped area that we aren't looking at enough.
I agree. Great question, by the way. So I pitched last week, or maybe the week before, with a group called Black Girl Ventures, which is a organization. Shelley Bell is the leader of that, where she's getting other corporations to donate dollars, and they're going city by city and allowing Black women founders to pitch, and then the audience votes on who gets the pot of money, and then there's some support through some consulting and etc. So to your point, I was telling people that I was going to pitch, and people was like, baseball? Like, what are you doing? And so, right? So in the venture capital world, or those who are accessing capital or revenue driving and raising, when you say you're going to do a pitch, they know that you're pitching to someone. But to many of my peers, they had no idea what that was or that it was a real thing. So this education piece, I think, is key, because if people understand what that process is, then they'll know who else to reach out to. Because I think the lack of access to capital is not just in the fact that it's not available, but people are not asking for it. If there's not applications or relationship and partnership building happening, then it's easy to say, well, we don't have anyone to fund because no one really came to us. So,
And people largely, investment is a trust relationship, and you build trust with people who look like you. That's just that's the way it is, unless you're actively counteracting that in your brain. And so, the more people of color, the more women of color become venture capital partners, the more women of color and people of color will be invested in. And so we fundamentally have to shift that.
So I know we didn't get to all of the questions. We will be around for a few minutes afterwards if you want to chat with us. But I'd like to, again, just thank Kyla and Melinda for coming and sharing their thoughts on this topic. And thank you for coming out and supporting this Tech Talk. You've been an amazing audience. Thank you.